Hi everyone, welcome to the Ed Collaborative Spring 2017 gathering. Today you are watching session number 1, workshop number 2 with Dana Stachowiak and Silvia Bettez. Over to you guys.
Hi there everybody, thanks for that introduction, Carolyn. So as she said, welcome to our session. It is called Literacy Classrooms as Emancipatory Spaces, Enacting Radical Love in Times of Hate. I'm Dana Stachowiak. I am here with Silvia Bettez. So we're just going to introduce ourselves really quickly. I will introduce myself as, first and foremost, as a consultant with the Educator Collaborative. I work primarily with grades K through 12 in social justice literacy and reading and writing workshop. When I'm not working with the Educator Collaborative, I am an assistant professor at the University of North Carolina at Wilmington, and I teach graduate master's and doc students in curriculum and instruction. Silvia.
And I'm Silvia Bettez, and I am an associate professor at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. I'm in the Educational Leadership and Cultural Foundations program. And basically, in a nutshell, I teach graduate students about issues of social justice. Many of them have been K through 12 educators and or educational leaders, and many of them are currently as well. Dana and I decided that we wanted to start off our day with telling you a story about our names. So I will start. My name is Silvia Bettez, and I'm going to tell a story about my first name. So my mom is Colombian, and my dad is white French Canadian. And they met when my dad was doing work in my mom's barrio in Bogota. And they got married and soon after had me. And then when I was born, what I've been told is that they had a conversation about how they wanted my name to sound really similar in English and in Spanish. So that's how my name got chosen. In Spanish, it sounds like Silvia, so it's almost the same. And they intentionally chose the Spanish spelling, which is why if you notice on our first slide, it's S-I-L, not S-Y-L-V-I-A. So I think I'll stop there. So that's a story of my name, and it matters to me. So when people misspell my name, I feel like they are overlooking who I am, and I understand that people do that, so I don't hold it against them and give them information about how to do it correctly. But I think that names are really important because they are about who we are.
So along with that, I don't have as beautiful as a story about my name. Not that I know of, I should probably ask my parents. But my name for me in particular is, I've always loved my name, my first name and my last name. It always, if somebody calls me and says, can I talk to Dana Stachowiak, I automatically know that it's somebody who's soliciting something, and so I say that you have the wrong number, and I'm not lying because they're not really asking for me. So I do like that about my last name, but my first name in particular, I've always loved my first name, and it wasn't until adulthood where I started thinking differently about gender and kind of pushing back on the gender binary that I came to really appreciate that my name is very gender neutral. So it could be a masculine name, it can be a feminine name, or it can be either or both, and so I really appreciate my name for that. It's just a quick introduction about who we are and our names, and I'm going to attempt to screen share here. Okay, great. So before we get moving along with the rest of the stuff that we're going to talk about today, I want to encourage you to live tweet along with the session, and you'll see my Twitter handle at Dr. Stachowiak on there. Silvia doesn't have a Twitter quite yet, but we're going to get her on there hopefully soon. But if you could just tweet to me and then use the hashtag the Ed Collab Gathering and then space, and I don't have it on the screen, but space and then hashtag 2, #2. So go ahead and tweet with us, and we'll try to multitask and also tweet back. You can also email us. I put my personal, we both put our emails down there that's easiest to reach us at. So feel free to jot those down and contact us during, after the session, 5 weeks from now, whenever, if something comes up, we're available.
Okay, so we have 4 main goals for today. First of all, we're going to start off by defining emancipatory spaces and radical love. So if those aren't terms that you're very familiar with, that's fine. We'll explain that to you. And then related to our title, we're going to talk about what we mean by hate in the current context. And then our final two goals are, first, to share how to create a space for students to engage in critical conversations, which we see as an act of radical love. And then finally, provide some specific strategies for diminishing hate through enacting radical love. So the first question is, what do we mean by emancipatory spaces? Basically, it means that we are creating spaces in our classroom where there are multiple opportunities to learn about, examine, discuss, and challenge privilege, power, and oppression. We recognize that for those of you who aren't in the field of social justice, these are some big terms, so we're going to break them down for you. So there are several different definitions of, or different ways of speaking about privilege, but one of the quotes that we really like is by Peggy McIntosh, and she says that privilege is like an invisible knapsack of special provisions, maps, passports, code books, visas, clothes, tools, and blank checks. Essentially, the key piece of this is that these are unearned assets, and not everybody has access to them. We gain access to them based upon the groups that we are a part of, the social groups that we are part of. So that means our race, our ethnicity, our gender identity, our social class. So being a part of these groups can provide us with some of these unearned assets. Another piece of this definition that I think is important to acknowledge, Peggy McIntosh says that these unearned assets are something about which we are meant to remain oblivious. So what happens with this is that the more privilege we have, the less likely we are to acknowledge or even know that we have it. So it often takes somebody who doesn't have the same kind of privilege that we have to point it out to us. And then when they do, it's often hard for us to see it. And so that's where the learning process needs to happen. The second definition that we want to give you is about power. And basically, in a nutshell, power is the ability to influence the behavior of others, and in particular as a result of your privilege. And then finally, oppression is when one group is able to enforce its prejudice and discrimination throughout society because it controls institutions. So in order to bring these home, what we're going to do is talk about examples of each of these. So Dana's going to take over and do that.
So you probably saw up on the screen there, as it was up for quite a while, as Silvia was talking about it, where there were different examples. So if we think about privilege very first as that something, an unearned advantage that we have. One example of that we like to use, because we're in North Carolina, both of us are in North Carolina right now, and the heated topic for the last year plus has been the bathroom bill in North Carolina. So when we think about privilege, an example of having privilege or not having privilege, if you have privilege, if you have particularly gender privilege, you don't have to worry about which bathroom you use. So I can use an example of myself. So I'm generally gender ambiguous, or sometimes more masculine and sometimes more feminine, and going to the bathroom doesn't always feel safe for me. Whereas Silvia, when she uses the restroom, it's very easy. She can look at the picture and see like, oh, that picture on the bathroom looks like me. But when I see the picture of the person on the bathroom, it doesn't reflect who I am. The one on the male restroom generally reflects who I am because I don't wear skirts, I wear pants and shorts. And so going to the bathroom for me shouldn't be an issue, but it can be for other people who have privilege, who look at me differently because of the way that I look. So an example of having privilege is not having to worry about using the bathroom. And then when we think about that with power, so the ability to influence the behavior of others. So we can think about that again with the bathroom bill, or with the thinking about bathrooms and who uses what bathroom, and how we decide who uses the bathroom. So we call people who have, who their gender identity matches their biological sex, we call those cisgender people. So an example of having power is that cisgender people are deciding for transgender people, or people like myself who are gender queer or gender ambiguous or gender non-conforming, they're choosing which bathroom is the right bathroom for trans people. So that's having power. And then where the oppression comes in is we felt it here in North Carolina, especially heavy, is that we have this this bathroom bill that you have to go to use the restroom that identifies with the gender that's listed on your birth certificate. And that may not reflect your gender identity or even what bathroom is safe for you to walk into. And so we've seen a lot of news pieces or self-reporting of folks of transgender males, for example, who are, because their birth certificate says female, they are required by the law to go into the women's restroom, and that's not necessarily a safe place for them to go. There's a lot of harassment and oppression that happens from there. So when we think about privilege, power, and oppression, using those examples can sometimes get heady and kind of the examples can get a little bit academic, but when we break it down to the examples, hopefully it's easier for us to understand. I know it is for me easier to understand when I think about privilege, power, and oppression, to think about examples. I'm trying to screen share here. I'm not very classy with this. So the next part, so we've talked about what do we mean by emancipatory spaces in our classrooms? And it's those spaces where we can talk about privilege, power, and oppression, and then really critically think about and challenge it. So what do we mean? How do we define radical love? So radical love is a particular interest of mine. It's something I've been studying in my work with gender identity and in classroom spaces in general. So how do we move with radical love? And I oftentimes get people who ask me, what is radical love versus love? So when we think of collectively radical love, we think of it as love amplified. So radical love isn't just telling somebody that you love them and that you care for them. I love Silvia a lot. I probably radically love Silvia. I radically love you, honey. So it's not necessarily that we love somebody and we have these good feelings towards them, but radical love, when we operate through radical love, we are operating in this place of making a conscientious choice to have critical conversations about privilege, power, and oppression in a loving way with other people. So it's really important that I talk to other folks who are cisgender about the bathroom bill and how it affects me and how it affects my trans friends in a way that talks about privilege, power, and oppression versus just walking up to them and saying, if you really love me, you would let me go to the bathroom wherever I wanted to go. Radical love, if we move through radical love, it's an invitation to say that we're going to commit to having these really critical conversations about what it means to operate in the system that's driven by privilege, power, and oppression. And so Paulo Freire talks about in Teachers as Cultural Workers, a book. If you haven't read that or you haven't read any of his work, I would encourage that you do. But he talks about these indispensable qualities for teaching with radical love, or he actually just talks about indispensable qualities for teaching, but in all of his work, he's talking about doing this through radical love. To sum this up, there are these on the screen, this number, I can't count them and I forgot what number. Six. These 6 different indispensable qualities that he talks about, and I'm just gonna share those with you quickly. So if you're thinking about teaching with radical love, which we encourage that, of course, first and foremost, it's a commitment to humility. So basically what he's saying here is you don't know what you don't know. So you always are learning and you're always growing. So I'm always stopping and thinking about what does privilege mean in my life, what does oppression mean in my life, and trying to really think about the ways in which I play into the system, how I affect that, and how the system affects me. And I'm constantly learning what that means. What does it mean to be white? What does it mean to be queer? What does it mean to be middle-class professor? The next one is having a dialectical ability. So this is just basically making sure that you are creating a classroom space, particularly your literacy classroom space, where not only are you having this, using your gift of talking to your students through critical topics, but you're also teaching your students this ability so that you can have dialogic spaces where you can talk collectively about things that matter. And then the next one is courage and tolerance. So I don't necessarily love the word tolerance, but it's there. It's something he believes in, and we hear this word a lot. So I focus mostly on courage. So courage is basically having the courage to talk about these topics in school. So a lot of times people will say to me, hey, Dana, I can't do this social justice work because I might get fired. Well, that's not necessarily true. So part of that courage also includes thinking about what are your rights as a teacher and what are the rights of students, and what line are you willing to cross, what risk are you willing to take, and what is that risk within having these conversations about critical topics around race, gender, sexuality, war, politics in our classrooms. And tolerance we talk about is, I'm just gonna ignore that because I don't really love that, and I'll let you all look that up. So decisiveness is also a really important skill to have. So if you're in this space in your classroom where you're having these really critical conversations, there's a lot of dialogue that's going on, your students are being really courageous about the things that they're talking about, and they're doing it with radical love with their classmates, you also need to, as the teacher, be able to exercise making decisions about, is this conversation necessarily appropriate? Where should it go from here? And how do I steer it in that way? Or do I just stop this conversation? So being able to just firmly make those decisions. And then also making decisions about what risks you're willing to take. You may not be willing to take risks, and that's okay. If you're working with radical love, if you're thinking about radical love, making those decisions to say, no, I can't talk about this topic is okay. But also recognizing that making the decisions to talk about those conversations could really save a life. The next one is sitting in between this tension between patience and impatience. So when we are talking about conversations, we oftentimes either want to move them forward really quickly, or we're not necessarily sure, how long should I linger on this? My students aren't getting it. We really want to sit in that tension, and that's a really great place to be. Are your students getting it? But also sitting within that tension of between patience and impatience with yourself. What things that you're thinking about when you're thinking about your humility, and thinking about the things that you only know what you don't know, and thinking about having patience with yourself and working through the impatience. And then just a joy of living that I think we kind of both collectively, I don't know, I'm speaking for you maybe, Silvia. Mm-hmm. I think of joy of living also as choosing self-care. So choosing ways in which I'm going to take care of myself when I'm doing this really courageous, sometimes risky work.
I have an idea for a definition of tolerance that
let's go back to that.
that I just came up with. So if you Google it, it may be very different. But for me, it's about creating the space for people to be who they are, without requiring them to change. And I prefer the term acceptance, because I see that as kind of moving a step ahead. So it's not like, you be who you are, I can be who I am, and I won't bother you, you don't bother me, but I really want to get to know who you are because I care about you. But I think we can't always get to that point, so creating a space, being tolerant, creating a space for people to be who they are is a good place to start, at least.
That's what I present with her. She can say smart things like that.
Well, I get to think about it while you're speaking.
Right. So. There's that. I'm smart too. And moving right along. Thank you for that.
Okay, so we have also come up with these tenets of radical love in a literacy classroom. And they're basically, we're breaking them down into three. One is critical community, the other is dialogic space, and then the third is critical reflective practice. And I'm going to start off by speaking about critical community. This is actually a term that I have been working with and developing myself. So I didn't come across it before I started speaking about it. Obviously, we talk about community building, and then there's a lot of information about what it means to be critical. So I'm bringing the two together. And basically, I would say that community building entails continually shifting groups of people who dialogue with, actively listen to, and support each other through reciprocal responsibility and accountability regarding a common interest or concern. So people come together around a common interest, they are accountable to each other, but then the critical piece is what I'm adding to it. And this is derived from critical theory. And I have a quote by Hinchy, who says critical theory calls our attention to places where choices have been made, and it clarifies whose goals those choices have served. So critical pedagogues strive to eliminate oppression, understand that all education is inherently political, and recognize that cultural and historical contexts affect individual agency. So it basically requires us to acknowledge that in any situation, there are multiple socially constructed realities. And I know that's a big phrase for some of you who aren't in graduate school, but basically that who we are is going to impact how we see things. And so that means that we're going to have different versions of the reality. And it also, a critical lens also requires us to pay attention to historical context and lived experiences that are continually impacted by issues of power and played out through complex interplays of structure and agency. So in this idea of critical community building, what I'm hoping to emphasize is that community building really matters, but it can only go so far if we're not paying attention to how power and privilege and oppression may be occurring, may be impacting the community that we're trying to build. So related to that, or actually a piece of critical community building, is this dialogic space. And the dialogic space is basically a commitment and capacity to take risks for the benefit of those we teach and ourselves. It means that we're creating a space where people can come together in conversation from who they are, people from different backgrounds, people who have different power in society, basically having equitable space to speak with each other, and that those perspectives that we bring are respected, and there's space for us to speak to each other without voices being shut out, essentially. And in order to do that, we need to be really critically reflective in our practice, which means that we need to think about who we are and how who we are impacts how we're thinking about things, and also thinking about that in relation to larger issues of power and privilege and oppression. So those are our main tenets of radical love in the literacy classroom.
So as we move to continue to talk about our title, to kind of give you the context of our presentation today, and just give you an understanding of what all of this means and how it can affect you as a teacher and how it can play a part in your classroom. So we're going to spend some time talking about what do we mean by in times of hate, because when we came up for the title for this, I think it was really powerful, and I think it still is, it still is. And then we both were like, well, wait a second, when we say in times of hate, that's a strong statement, in times of hate. So what I want to talk about first is that we see hate outside of the classroom, and we see hate when we talked about this and we thought about it. We see hate outside the classroom in headlines, in the news. I mean, we're bombarded daily. Even if you just look at this weekend in the last 48 hours, the headlines that we've been bombarded with. So I slapped up a bunch of headlines that I've found just over the last several weeks that they've happened. So when we think about these things, these are the things that kids are seeing when they go home, when they watch the news, when they get on the internet. So without our guidance and without our support, they're seeing these headlines, and we know our students, they're probably just seeing the headlines. Maybe some of them are reading the rest of the article, but they're seeing these headlines, and just having these headlines on the screen for me, I have quite a reaction. I mean, immigration ban provokes crisis. So there's a ban on certain people, there's crisis, that's a word that sticks out. Mother of 4 deported to Mexico. I'm thinking of my own students who might be sitting there having a family from Mexico who they're worried about being deported, and seeing that this is actually happening. Terrorist and manhunt underway. I mean, just the word manhunt and the word terrorist together is frightening even as an adult. So thinking about, these are the things that kids are going to encounter outside of the classroom when they're not with us. And then they're likely to hear adults talking about these things too, right? So not everybody in this world, as we know, is equipped with having critical conversations about things. Oftentimes we've seen in our climate right now, things are turn quite political, and it's quite polarized, and we're hearing conversations about the country's more divided than ever, and wherever that is, but we're hearing about that, right? And so we know these conversations are happening. So students are also then likely to hear adults talking about this, yet we don't bring this stuff into the classroom. And when we do bring it in the classroom, we oftentimes see it in social studies, where we kind of shallowly talk about what are the headlines for the day, and we talk about what it means, and then we move on and do the rest of our day, and we don't really infiltrate these into the classroom. And what we're encouraging is that we don't want you to bring the hate from outside of the classroom into the classroom, but what we want you to do is bring these headlines in and these topics in and have conversations about them. So the goal here is to connect our literacy strategies to the context outside of the classroom. And when we think about that, so when we're creating this space, the ultimate goal is to create a space to be able to have these critical conversations. So I just pulled one of the headlines that stuck out to me quite a bit that we've been talking about. We see up in and out of the news, and it isn't maybe as jarring as children in Syria being gassed or missile strikes, is the immigration ban provokes crisis. So what we did here is we've come up with a set of critical thinking questions that can push these critical conversations. And if you look to the right of the screen where it has global citizen, we actually got some of these questions, or at least the stems of these questions, from the ultimate checklist for critical thinking that we used as a guide, and it's from Global Citizen. So if you type in and you Google the ultimate checklist, cheat sheet, sorry, the ultimate cheat sheet for critical thinking in Global Citizens, you'll be able to find this really easily. So we've created the space for critical conversation, or we're hoping to work on creating this critical space for conversation. And when we think about the practices of radical love that we first talked about, and that Silvia's talked about a little bit, is that it relates to our second practice of radical love, which is creating a dialogic space. And when we think about these questions, we are in essence creating that space. So I want to talk about how we came to these questions. So these critical thinking questions, obviously, who is most directly affected by the ban? Well, we didn't find that exact question from the sheet, but we use the question stems, and that's really important for you as a teacher. So when you go to this cheat sheet, you're going to find 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 different questions listed under who. But you don't necessarily want to hand out these questions to your students without any context. So we've chosen what are the questions that help us to have the most critical conversation about this particular topic, the immigration ban provokes crisis. And then we decided to pull out, now what is that question going to look like if we relate it directly to the ban? So as you're going through that, we don't encourage you, I mean, you could ultimately hand out the cheat sheet to your students and have them create their own questions, but we first would recommend that you create these questions and you share with them how to then create the questions within the context of conversations that they're going to have.
The other thing that we wanted to say about that is that this directly relates to what you want to do in your classroom in terms of writing. So you pose these questions as writing prompts, and then you can have them pair share about what they wrote, and then you can have them revise based on the discussion that they have, and then share out with the big group as a dialogue, and that's where you can have those critical conversations happening. So often what we hear from teachers in the schools is, but we have to have our students write, we have these particular things that we need to do. And what we're trying to do are provide strategies so that you can bring in these critical conversations in ways that map onto what you need to do with your students at your grade level. And that's the other thing, of course, is that you would make all of this grade level specific. And we have an example that might fit some of you really well, but you all have the knowledge and the skills to change them into the kind of questions that would work for the students that you're working with.
So the next part we're going to break down is hate inside the classroom, specifically related to bullying.
Okay, so Unfortunately, of course, there isn't just hate occurring outside, but it happens within our schools as well. We put a couple of common examples up here. So you might hear a student say something like, "You're so gay," to another student, or to a student who's from another country, "President Trump is going to send you back to where you came from." Or for smaller children, maybe they heard something at home, and one child says to another, "My parent said I shouldn't play with you." So then, of course, the question is, well, what do you do about this? And what we want to do is come back to this by switching back to this critical community building framework. So first, I'm going to kind of talk you through what the components of this framework are, and then give some critical community building strategies, and then speak to how that relates to addressing hate within the classroom. So in this critical community building framework, there are three main components to it. The first is to remain open and flexible. I like to think of it as a web that's really porously bordered. So it shifts as needed, rain can fall on it. Sometimes there are pieces of it that fall apart and then can be put back together. Obviously, in your classrooms, you have students who are going to be absent. You have students that come and go at different points in the year. So we can't keep our communities insular, and we can't have it so that people can't move in and move out. So being open and flexible. And what that means is we're always going to have a disposition towards connectiveness. And most specifically, I think that this means being welcoming and hospitable. And then I'll speak more about this, but also creating agreements for working together. I'll speak more about that in terms of strategies. The second component of the framework is engaging in dialogue through active listening and critical question posing. So active listening, there's so much that you can Google about how to be a really good active listener, but basically you want to create space for everybody to speak. And you can have that in your agreements. I'll speak about that a little bit when we're talking about strategies. You want to have students demonstrate that they're paying attention, and you also to demonstrate that you're paying attention to them. And then most specifically, related to critical conversations, be open to new ideas that differ from your worldview. And then the piece of the critical question posing, this is really where the critical piece comes in the critical community building framework. And in order to do this, we have to have an openness. We need to allow ourselves to be vulnerable in some ways, and we have to be self-reflexive, connecting to our third tenet that we mentioned earlier. And we have to have some skills for posing critical questions, and that's where the ultimate cheat sheet for critical thinking can really come in handy. And then finally, in order for this to work, we need to commit and be accountable. So a definition of commitment that I like is the willingness to make a promise with no expectation in return. So we commit to the group, we promise to care about the well-being of the group without being sure how others are going to return that expectation. And then accountability is the willingness to care for the well-being of the whole. And we, in our schooling system, it's so set up to be competitive. So we often don't speak about how we can be there for our peers and for each other. And so that is a shift in the framing that we typically have in K-12 and higher ed education. So now what I'd like to do is share some specific strategies. I think, so I have a few strategies for the first day, and then a few strategies that are important for us to do generally. On the first day, I know many of you are often, you have to have rules for your classroom. And this is related to that, but it's shifting the language, and it's shifting the way that we're approaching this. So instead of giving your students rules, we can think about collectively creating agreements for working together while emphasizing community. So that brings in this piece of, if we start off by posing questions and having an attitude of, we are here not only for our own well-being, but for the well-being of the whole, then we can emphasize, okay, well, if that's the case, what is it that we need to do so that we can best be our best selves, all of us in the classroom. And one way to do this is to collectively create agreements. Now, obviously, depending on the grade level that you're working with, you may have to bring in some general agreements of how you work together. And those could start with the kind of rules you typically have in your classroom. I prefer, with older students, to actually start from the ground up and really just pose questions like, what would be helpful for us to do to best work together? Or what do we want our class agreements for working together to be? Or you could even ask, what do you need to have a successful learning environment? How is it that you need to work with each other? And then you open it for brainstorming. And I do that. I will open up a document or write on a whiteboard. And basically, I don't censor as they're putting up what is important to them and list everything on there. And I'll tell them that, and that we'll have time to go back to it. So every student has an opportunity to say something about something that matters to them for creating the best working space in their classroom. And then once you have this, what often is a very long list, you can ask them to review it and see if there's anything that they don't feel comfortable with, that they would either like to remove or add or change, and then have a dialogue about this. And this is the space where you can bring in anything that is important to you. So for example, if my students don't bring up, I always suggest an agreement that's something like, if you tend to speak a lot, be sure to create space for others to speak. And if you tend not to speak, try to take the risk to speak up in the classroom so that you're sharing as a part of the community. Then once you have this long list, as a teacher, you can say that you're going to take them and combine them, because you don't want 30 things. You want something that's going to be really agreements that people can go back to. And then once you have that list, you can ask them if they agree to it and get to consensus. Basically, if we can all agree to these rules, raise your hands. And if somebody doesn't, then you have a conversation about that. So ultimately, you come to consensus. And then once you have them, it's really important that you have the space, you have them accessible. So you write them up, you post them, but also say that you can keep them fluid. So if there's something that needs to be added or changed to continue to create the best space learning environment, because we all change, then that can happen. But particularly important to have in these agreements is what you're going to do if somebody says or does something that hurts another person. And something that's worked well in my classes, and when I say my classes, I'm talking about graduate students, so we need to do this in any class, but it could work at any grade level, is literally that anytime anybody feels hurt, they can say the word ouch. So what this does is it stops the moment in the classroom. And the way that we typically work out what's going to happen when somebody says ouch is, at any moment, if somebody feels hurt, they can say that word. If they say it out loud, then my role as the educator is to step in as facilitator. The first thing that I need to do is ask the person who said it if they're willing to or want to say something more about what hurt them. And then once they say something about what hurt them, then I will ask the person who hurt them if they would like to respond. And then that opens up a conversation. So these agreements are paramount in creating a good critical community. And then you can do activities to promote connection on the first day. We modeled this, Dana and I modeled this at the beginning when we shared our story. And then generally, we want to greet people warmly. So you may have seen on social media, there's a picture of a teacher in what looks like a high school where every student that they're interacting with, they have an individualized handshake. One of my favorite movies about education is a movie called Precious Knowledge, in which you see the teacher outside greeting everybody. And then of course you want to try to rearrange the space so that it's set up for people to communicate with each other. And you want to always be promoting collaboration more than competition. We're so set up to do that. And then, of course, for the critical piece, you want to ask critical thinking questions throughout. Okay.
So we've just got about 5 more minutes left. So we're gonna end this with continuing our conversation about strategies. So Silvia went from critical community building, used critical community building, and I'm going to talk specifically about radical love. However, it's important to know that these things, it's not an either or, they come together. So if you follow me on Twitter, my 408 followers that I have, or if you know me, you know that I love Michael Franti. So of course I could not pass up the chance today to talk about a lesson that I actually have done at levels K through 12 with some Michael Franti lyrics. So I'm going to share the screen here with you. So Michael Franti, if you don't know his work, he is a singer-songwriter activist who he sings about peace, love, and social justice and unity. And I love a lot of his lyrics. Some of them aren't necessarily appropriate for school. So if you listen to his lyrics, make sure you're watching what lyrics you're going to use. But one of the lyrics that I like it comes from a song that he sings called Power to the Peaceful. And he sings, all the freaky people make the beauty of the world. And usually at his concerts when he's singing this song, he repeats this line over and over again, and the crowd gets in and sings along with him. And so I use this, I have used this in my classrooms if you look on the right side of the screen, if we divide our paper either front to back, I usually did front and back, and then, or you can split it in half. And on one side, put things that make me freaky and things that make me beautiful. And then either have your kids write or draw or both about what makes them freaky and what makes them beautiful. Now, you are going to have those students who are going to say, hey, the same thing that makes me freaky is the same thing that makes me beautiful. And I think that's really the core of this, of doing this activity, this writing and speaking activity. So what you would do is have the kids spend some time, have the students spend some time working on things that make them freaky, things that make them beautiful, and then engage in conversation about, actually, it really is the things that make us freaky, make us beautiful. And sometimes the things that make us beautiful also make us freaky. And these conversations that hopefully you'll push through this is to bring together the classmates, and thinking about our differences are actually what make us who we are. And so we need to celebrate those differences, respect those differences, and recognize that, while one person might not understand what makes you different, what makes you freaky, as we like to call it, it is actually what makes you beautiful. So hopefully that encourages some conversation around that. And then the next activity is also with lyrics, which I often juxtapose these lyrics with the story of Ruby Bridges. So Lori McKenna wrote this song called Ruby Shoes about the story of Ruby Bridges. So oftentimes or actually every time I've taught this, I've read the book first, we've studied the book, we've studied Ruby's life, and then we've also looked at the lyrics. So a really good exercise that you can do with your students is to have them analyze the lyrics, the song lyrics, using those critical thinking question stems. So I've just highlighted on the screen some examples of how this might work with this particular song. So you'll see that I have circled where she sings, well, color is such an amazing illusion. So ask the students, well, what does she mean by that? Do we mean the color of our skin? Of course she does here, but then what does it mean that the color of the skin is an illusion? And you see the lyric, but that is, they hated her for the color of her skin. And then we can talk about the larger systemic issues around racism and how we rank and press people based on their race. Also, a way to push back, I think, is important on lyrics. So if you look at the lyrics here, it says, walk a mile in Ruby's shoes. And as I think about that, can we ever really walk in somebody's shoes? And we cannot, right? But then why is it problematic to think about this? So a lot of times I hear teachers say, well, if you just walk a mile in their shoes, or, just imagine what it would be like. It's really difficult to think about what it would be like, because if we're thinking about, if we're trying to see things through somebody else's eyes, but we don't have their same experience, we're still going to be telling those stories based on our own stories. And then when we're thinking about this, even thinking about what other people's stories might be, how do we honor other people's stories and also exercise empathy at the same time? And we're running out of time, but this is archived. You can come back and pause it and take a look at that. But I encourage you to do this same type of thing with maybe your favorite lyrics from an artist, Michael Franti, who sings about peace, love, social justice, and unity. It can really provoke really great critical conversations.
And I guess one thing I would like to say, going back to the hate in the classroom, is that if you have these strategies and you have it set up so that you've created this community and a space for people to speak up when they're hurt, then that opens up those conversations so that ideally a student will say, ouch, and then you can have that space to dialogue about it.
So I think that's it for our time. So thank you for closing that way. I think that was smart. If you want to flip back through and see where to connect with us, my on Twitter is @Dr. Stachowiak, hashtag the Ed Collab Gathering, and then I'll also make sure to post this screen with the Twitter and our email addresses up on my Twitter account so that you can get a hold of us if you need. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks.
Thank you, Dana. Thank you, Silvia. That was a very insightful presentation on on self-love and equity. So thank you so much for that. I do want to share with our audience our upcoming presentations. So do stay with us. Coming up next, we have a lot of very exciting presentations. We have Donalyn Miller and Travis Crowner talking about expanding your worldview in young adult literature. We have session 2. We have Stephanie Schwab, which is workshop. I think that is that's the upcoming workshop. Stephanie Schwab talking about the summer reading and going from summer slide to summer success. We also have Heather Rocker and her team talking about innovative approaches to professional development. And Molly Wood and Eric Lepp is talking about using powerful poetry to increase writing in primary grades. So do stay tuned with us and join us in the upcoming next sessions. Thanks once again for joining us and see you in the next sessions. Bye-bye.